Okay, so we left off yesterday with John McNabb trying to strike out Jeffrey, and he's not able to, and he throws the frog, and Jeffrey bunts the frog, and he runs and makes it to home. And John McNabb says that the runt better not show his face again, and because of all the crazy interactions that Jeffrey had that day, he ends up becoming known as Maniac. And so now we're in chapter 9. It says, John McNabb had never in his life met a kid he couldn't strike out, until the runt. Now, as he thought about it, he came to two conclusions. One, he couldn't stand having this blemish on his record. And two, if you beat a kid up, it's the same as striking him out. So McNabb and his pals went looking for the kid. They called themselves the Cobras. Nobody messed with them. At least, nobody in the West End. Remember, the West End is mostly white. The Cobras had heard that the kid hung around the park and the tracks, and that's where they spotted him one Saturday afternoon on the tracks by the path that ran from the Oriole Street dead end to the park. He was down by Red Hill and heading away from them, book in hand as usual. But the Cobras just stood there, stunned. I don't believe it, one Cobra said. Must be a trick, said another. I heard about it, said another, but I didn't believe it. It wasn't a trick. It was true. The kid was running on the rail. McNabb scooped up a handful of track stones. He launched one. He snarled, He's dead. Let's get him. By the time Maniac looked back, they were almost on him. He wobbled once, leapt from the rail to the ground, and took off. He was at the Oriole Street dead end, but his instinct said no, not the street. Too much open space. He stuck with the tracks. Coming into view above him was the house on Raco Hill where he had eaten spaghetti. He could go there, to the whistling mother, the other kids, be safe. They wouldn't follow him in there, would they? This gives us a little hint as to a character trait of Maniac. He considers going to the Pickwells where they had so many people that no one noticed that he was at dinner that day. But he's considering their safety. So that gives us a little bit of a character trait insight into Maniac. Stones clanked off the steel rails. He darted left, skirted the dump, wove through the miniature mountain range of stone piles and into the trees, skiing on his heels down the steep bank and into the creek, frogs plopping, no time to look for stepping rocks. Yells behind him now, war whoops, stones pelting the water, stinging his back. Ah, the other side. Through the trees and the picker bushes, past the armory jeeps and out to the park boulevard, past the Italian restaurant on the corner, the bakery, screeching tires, row houses, streets, alleys, cars, porches, windows, faces staring, faces, the town whizzing past Maniac, a blur of faces, each face staring from its own window, each face in its own personal frame, its own house, its own address, some place to be when there was no other place to be. How lucky to be a face staring out from a window. So he's going through, and there's all these, there are row houses, there are apartments. That means there's a lot of people in a close proximity, little apartments, little houses all together. And as he's going past, there's all these faces, and all those faces belong in those little houses and those little apartments. They all have an address. They all have a place they belong. And we contrast that with Maniac, who right now does not have a place where he belongs. And then, could it be? The voices behind him were growing faint. He slowed, turned, stopped. They were lined up at a street a block back. They were still yelling and shaking their fists, but they weren't moving off the curb. And now they were laughing. Why were they laughing? The Cobras were standing at Hector Street. Hector Street was the boundary between the East and the West Ends, or to put it another way, between the blacks and the whites. Not that you never saw a white in the East End or a black in the West End. People did cross the line now and then, especially if they were adults, and it was daylight. But nighttime, forget it. And if you were a kid, day or night, forget it. Unless you had business on the other side, such as a sports team or school. But don't be just strolling along as if you belonged there, as if you weren't afraid. As if you didn't even notice you were a different color from everybody around you. The Cobras were laughing because they figured the dumb, scraggly runt would get out of the East End in about as good shape as a bare big toe in a convention of snapping turtles. All right, chapter 10. Of course, Maniac didn't know any of that. He was simply glad the chase was over. He turned and started walking, catching his breath. East Chestnut, East Marshall, Green Street, Arch Street. He had been around here before. That first day with the girl named Amanda. Other days jogging through. But this was Saturday, not a school day, and there was something different about the streets. Kids, all over. One of them jumped down from a front step and planted himself right in front of Maniac. Maniac had to jerk to a stop to keep from plowing into the kid. Even so, their noses were practically touching. Maniac blinked and stepped back. The kid stepped forward. Each time Maniac stepped back, the kid stepped forward. They traveled practically half a block that way. Finally, Maniac turned and started walking. The kid jumped around and plunked himself in front again. He bit off a chunk of the candy bar he was holding. "Where you going?" he said. Candy bar flakes flew from his mouth. "I'm looking for Sycamore Street," said Maniac. "Do you know where it is?" "Yeah, I know where it is." Maniac waited, but the kid said nothing more. "Well, do you think you could tell me where it is?" Stone was softer than the kid's glare. "No." Maniac looked around. Other kids had stopped playing. They were staring. Someone called, "Do him, Mars!" Someone else, "Waste him!" The kid, as you probably guessed by now, was none other than Mars Bar Thompson. Mars Bar heard the calls and the stone got harder. Then suddenly he stopped glaring. Suddenly he was smiling. He held up the candy bar an inch from Maniac's lips. "Want a bite?" So his nickname is Mars Bar Thompson. Mars Bar was a type of candy bar that you used to see a bit more in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I don't know if they still make them or not, but that was a common candy bar. It'd be like if his nickname was Hershey Bar or something like that. So obviously he likes candy bars, chocolate bars in particular. And you also notice that when he jumps down, he gets right in Maniac's face. And anywhere Maniac tries to go, Mars Bar is there. Now, normally we would know if we were walking and someone got right in our face, and whatever way we tried to go, they tried to block it, we would know something was up. But Maniac doesn't catch on to that. That's what we call a social cue. We can tell that someone's angry, someone's upset, someone's messing with us, someone's being sarcastic. Some of us can tell that. But Mars Bar is acting this way with Maniac, and Maniac, or Jeffrey, doesn't seem to catch on. He doesn't get it. He's just trying to go. He also doesn't seem to catch on that he is in a part of town that's mostly black, whereas the other part of town was mostly white. He doesn't catch on to that. A lot of people have this idea that this is our part of town, that's their part of town. Maniac doesn't care. And so that's one of the things that we see about him there. So Mars Bar holds out the candy bar that he's bitten off of and says, "Want a bite?" Maniac couldn't figure. "You sure?" "Yeah, go ahead. Take a bite." Now, if someone did that, most of us would not do what Maniac's about to do. Maniac shrugged, took the Mars Bar, bit off a chunk, and handed it back. "Thanks." Dead silence along the street. The kid had done the unthinkable. He had chomped on one of Mars's own bars. Not only that, but white kids just didn't put their mouths where black kids had had theirs, be it soda bottles, spoons, or candy bars, and the kid hadn't even gone for the unused end. He had chomped right over Mars Bar's own bite marks. So we can tell from that paragraph, this is showing, now obviously in common sense, we would say don't eat or drink after other people. From the same cups and things like that unless they've been cleaned. But back then, people did, except there was a prejudice for white kids not eating or drinking from the same things that a black kid had, or vice versa. I grew up knowing kids who were black who had that prejudice against white kids who had that prejudice against black kids. You don't see that much today, thank God. But that was kind of the prejudice. So we're seeing the time period. It's not Jim Crow, which we learned about when we looked at Rosa Parks, and it's not the law, but it's the culture, and the culture is that black people and white people mostly are completely separate in this town. Not the law, but the culture. But does Maniac see that? No. Maniac doesn't view people in those categories. So Mars Bar was confused. Who was this kid? What was this kid? As usual, when Mars Bar got confused, he got mad. He thumped Maniac in the chest. You think you bad or something? Maniac, who was now twice as confused as Mars Bar, blinked. Huh? You think you come down here and be bad? That what you think? Mars Bar was practically shouting now. No, said Maniac, I don't think I'm bad. I'm not saying I'm an angel either. Not even real good. Somewhere in between, I guess. So he's not catching sarcasm. He's being serious back. Mars Bar jammed his arms downward, stuck out his chin, sneered. Am I bad? Maniac was befuddled. I don't know. One minute you're yelling at me, the next minute you're giving me a bite of your candy bar. The chin jutted out more. Tell me I'm bad. Maniac didn't answer. Flies stopped buzzing. I said, tell me I'm bad. Maniac blinked, shrugged, sighed. It's none of my business. If you're bad, let your mother or father tell you. Now it was Mars Bar doing the blinking, stepping back, trying to sort things out. After a while, he looked down. What's that? Before Maniac answered a book, Mars Bar had snatched it from his hand. This ain't yours, he said. He flipped through some pages. Looks like mine. It's somebody else's. It's mine. I'm keeping it. With rattlesnake speed, Maniac snatched the book back except for one page which stayed ripped in Mars Bar's hand. Give me the page, said Maniac. Mars Bar grinned. Take it, Fishbelly. Silence. Eyes. The flies were waiting. East End vultures. Suddenly, neither kid could see the other because a broom came down like a straw curtain between their faces and a voice said, I'll take it. It was the lady from the nearest house, out to sweep her steps. She lowered the broom but kept it between them. Better yet, she said to Mars Bar, just give it back to him. Mars Bar glared up at her. There wasn't an 11-year-old in the East End who could stand up to Mars Bar's glare. In the West End, even high schoolers were known to crumble under the glare. To old ladies on both sides of Hector Street, it was all but fatal. And when Mars Bar stepped off a curb and combined the glare with his super slow drip-straddle slump shuffle, well, it was said he could back up traffic all the way to Bridgeport while he took 10 minutes to cross the street. They're saying all these details about Mars Bar to let us know this is a bad kid nobody better mess with. But not this time. This time Mars Bar was up against an East End lady in her prime, and she was matching him eyeball for eyeball. And when it was over, only one glare was left standing, and it wasn't Mars Bar's. Mars Bar handed back the torn page, but not before he crumpled it into a ball. The broom pushed him away, turned him around, and swept him up the street. The lady looked down at Maniac. A little of the glare lingered in her eyes. You better get on, boy, where you belong. I can't be following you around. I got things to do. Maniac just stood there a minute. There was something he felt like doing, and maybe he would have. But the lady turned and went back inside her house and shut the door. So he walked away. The lady saves him. She's looking out for him. He has a little bit of a feeling, but then the lady's gone. And you don't have to get this, but the idea is I think that he feels a little bit like hugging her. Remember, Maniac doesn't have a mom. And this is a woman who's looking out for him. And he has a little bit of a feeling that he doesn't quite know what to do with, but then the lady's gone. Alright, chapter 11. Now what? Maniac uncrumpled the page, flattened it out as best he could. He could return the book to Amanda how could he return the book to Amanda in this condition? He couldn't. But he had to. It was hers. Judging from that morning, she was pretty finky about her books. What would make her matter? To not get the book back at all, or to get it back with the page ripped out? Maniac cringed at both prospects. He wandered around the East End, jogging slowly, in no hurry now to find 728 Sycamore Street. He was passing a vacant lot when he heard an all too familiar voice. "Hey, Fishbelly!" He stopped, turned. This time Mars Bar wasn't alone. A handful of other kids trailed him down the sidewalk. Maniac waited. Coming up to him, Mars Bar said, "Where you running, boy?" "Nowhere." "You running from us? You afraid?" "No, I just like to run." "You want to run?" Mars Bar grinned. "Go ahead. We'll give you a head start." Maniac grinned back. "No thanks." He still doesn't quite get what's going on. I mean, he's just smiling back. They smile at him, and they're being sarcastic or slightly ironic, and he smiles back. Mars Bar held out his hand. "Give me my book." Maniac shook his head. Mars Bar glared. "Give me it." Maniac shook his head. Mars Bar reached for it. Maniac pulled it away. They moved in on him now. They backed him up. Some high schoolers were playing basketball up the street, but they weren't noticing. And there wasn't a broom-swinging lady in sight. Maniac felt a hard flatness against his back. Suddenly his world was very small and very simple. A brick wall behind him, a row of scowling faces in front of him. He clutched the book with both hands. The faces were closing in. A voice called, "That you, Jeffrey?" The faces parted. At the curb was a girl on a bike. Amanda. She hoisted the bike to the sidewalk and walked it over. She looked at the book, at the torn page. "Who ripped my book?" Mars Bar pointed at Maniac. "He did." Amanda knew better. "You ripped my book." Mars Bar's eyes went big as headlights. "I did not." "You did. You lie." "I didn't." "You did." She let the bike fall to Maniac. She grabbed the book and started kicking Mars Bar in his beloved sneakers. "I got a little brother and a little sister that crayon all over my books, and I got a dog that eats them and poops on them, and that's just inside my own family, and I'm not gonna have nobody else messing with my books. You understand?" And then Mars Bar was hauling up on the street past the basketball players who were rolling on the asphalt with laughter. Amanda took the torn page from Maniac. To her, it was the broken wing of a bird, a pet out in the rain. She turned misty eyes to Maniac. "It's one of my favorite pages." Maniac smiled. "We can fix it." The way he said it, she believed. "Want to come to my house?" she said. "Sure," he said. Chapter 12. When they walked in, Amanda's mother was busy with her usual tools, a yellow plastic bucket and a sponge. She was scrubbing purple crayon off the TV screen. "Mom," said Amanda, "this is Jeffrey," she whispered. "What's your last name?" He whispered, "Magee." She said, "Magee." Mrs. Bill held up a hand and said, "Hold it," and went on scrubbing. When she finally finished, she straightened up, turned, and said, "Now, what?" "Mom, this is Jeffrey Magee. You know." Amanda was hardly finished when Maniac zipped across the room and stuck out his hand. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Bill." "Mrs. Bill." They shook hands. Mrs. Bill smiled. "So you're the book boy." She started nodding. Amanda came home one day. "Mom, there's a boy I loaned one of my books out to." "Loaned a book? You?" "Mom, he practically made me. He really likes books. I met him on—" "Mom!" Amanda screeched. "I never said all that." Mrs. Bill nodded solemnly. "No, of course you didn't," and gave Maniac a huge wink which made Amanda screech louder until something crashed in the kitchen. Mrs. Bill ran. Amanda and Maniac ran. The scene in the kitchen stopped them cold. One little girl, eyes wide, standing on a countertop. One little boy, eyes wide, standing just below her on a chair. One shattered glass jar, and some stringy, pale-colored glop on the floor. One growing cloud of sauerkraut fumes. The girl was Hester, age 4. The boy was Lester, age 3. In less than 5 minutes, while Mrs. Bill and Amanda cleaned up the floor, Hester and Lester and their dog Bow Wow were in the backyard wrestling and tickling and jumping and just generally going wild with their new buddy and victim, Maniac Magee. Maniac was still there when Mr. Bill came home from his Saturday shift at the tire factory. He was there for dinner when Hester and Lester pushed their chairs alongside his. He was there to help Amanda mend her torn book. He was there watching TV afterward with Hester riding one knee, Lester the other. He was there when Hester and Lester came screaming down the stairs with the book, Amanda screaming even louder after them, the kids shoving the book and themselves onto Maniac's lap, Amanda finally calming down because they didn't want to crayon the book. They only wanted Maniac to read. And so he read Lyle, Lyle, Crocodile to Hester and Lester, and even though they pretended not to listen, to Amanda and Mr. and Mrs. Beale. And he was there when Hester and Lester were herded upstairs to bed, and Mrs. Beale said, "Don't you think it's about time you're heading home, Jeffrey? Your parents will be wondering." So Maniac, wanting to say something but not knowing how, got into the car for Mr. Beale to drive him home. And then he made his mistake. He waited for only 2 or 3 blocks to go by before saying to Mr. Beale, "This is it." Mr. Beale stopped, but he didn't let Maniac out of the car. He looked at him funny. Mr. Beale knew what his passenger apparently didn't. East End was East End, and West End was West End, and the house this white lad was pointing to was filled with black people, just like every other house on up to Hector Street. Mr. Beale pointed this out to Maniac. Maniac's lips started to quiver, and right there, with the car idling in the middle of the street, Maniac told him that he didn't really have a home, unless you counted the deer shed at the zoo. Mr. Beale made a U-turn right there and headed back. Only Mrs. Beale was still downstairs when they walked into the house. She listened to no more than 10 seconds worth of Mr. Beale's explanation before saying to Maniac, "You're staying here." Not long after, Maniac was lying in Amanda's bed, Amanda having been carried over to Hester and Lester's room, where she often slept anyway. Before Maniac could go to sleep, however, there was something he had to do. He flipped off the covers and went downstairs. Before the puzzled faces of Mr. and Mrs. Beale, he opened the front door and looked at the 3 cast iron digits nailed to the door frame. 728. He kept staring at them, smiling. Then he closed the door, said a cheerful good night, and went back to bed. Maniac Magee finally had an address. Alright, so Maniac seems to have made home with the Beale family in the East End, but we're only about 1/3 of the way through the book, so there's more twists and turns and adventures that await us.